Welcome to the third module, Volunteer Rocket, where we're going to talk about attracting people to your volunteer ministry area. We found that it's better to attract people according to a plan, not just pressure. And so in this module, Michael's going to help you develop a plan to attract as many volunteers as you need to your volunteer area.
Well, in the last session, Casey introduced you to the entire Volunteer Rocket system that is A, B, C, D, and E. And in this particular module, we're going to dive deep into the first one. We're going to dive deep into the attract volunteer thing. And here's what I'm going to teach you in this system. I'm going to teach you 4 principles of attracting volunteers, and then I'm going to show you 5 different models for how 5 different churches do that. And so what I want to go ahead and give you right off the bat, so if you just want to go ahead and get out your listening guide and fill this all in right off the bat, I want to give you the bottom line of this session, and it's this. It's to ask according to a plan, not under pressure. Ask according to a plan, not under pressure. And so what we've seen most churches do is they ask for volunteers when they need volunteers. And we're going to actually show you a system by which you can ask for volunteers and attract volunteers into a system according to a plan, not just when there's a catastrophe or an emergency or when people aren't showing up in the nursery or there's some big event that's going on. And again, as we unpack this, ask according to plan, not under pressure, there's a few things we've got to realize is that we need in our church a volunteer ministry, not just more volunteers. I know a lot of times we think, we just need more people, we just need more people, we just need more people. But if you'll actually design the system, the ministry, if you'll actually do the work on creating a healthy volunteer ministry, then you'll find that you'll have more volunteers. And we also say, and another way to say it is this, is that you need a volunteer system, not just a sermon. And so I know a lot of times we think, well, when there's that crisis, somebody comes to the pastor and we say, we don't have enough kids ministry volunteers, so can you please preach on the importance of the next generation and get people to sign up? Or we need a bunch of people to do this, so can you work it into the message? Or somebody will come up to you right before the service and say, here's an announcement for you, and it's for some ministry. And it's not sermons that are going to solve your volunteer problem. Sermons might be a part of it. It's a system. And so in this session, we're going to teach you a system for how to attract volunteers to serve in your ministry, to how to ask according to a plan, not under pressure. So I want to go ahead and give you the 4 principles, and then we're going to come back and I'll show you the 5 models. Here's the first principle of asking for volunteers. Principle number 1 is ask often. Ask often. And so here's what I mean by that. You need frequent, what we call on-ramps, frequent on-ramps where people can constantly jump in to serving at your church. That needs to be built into the rhythm. It needs to be built into the calendar. It needs to be built into your system, that you have frequent jumping on points where people can jump into serving. And so there's a big difference between asking out of a time of crisis and frequently asking on purpose. And what we want to teach you to do and encourage you to do is to build into your calendar, when are you bringing volunteers into the ministry? When are you asking for volunteers to serve? Now, there's a ton of ways that you can do this, and we're going to give you some examples from churches, but some of the most common ways that we see people ask for volunteers with these frequent on-ramps, and let me just give you some of them. First of all, there's the interest card. We talked to a church here in Atlanta called Freedom Church, and they have different ways that people can get connected, but all of them point to an interest card, to where there's a card that somebody fills out with their name and a little bit of information and where they're interested in serving. And whether they're at an orientation or a new member class or in a service, it's this card. And the interest card is a great on-ramp for people. And here's what we've just kind of seen over time. We've seen that you need to get 10 cards filled out if you want to get 1 leader. So, I mean, a lot of people will fill out a card, but moving people through a process, 10 cards to 1 leader, we've just kind of seen that. Another use of this interest card, my buddy Tony McCollum at Freedom Church does this. He actually has a wall of opportunities. And on that wall, and I've seen other churches that do this, we used to do this as well, where there'll be just a wall that says, here's some opportunities to serve in guest services. And people can come up and take one of those cards off and just read a little bit more, take it home, think about it, and it always has the contact information on that. So you've got interest cards, you've got cards on a wall. Another way to frequently ask, because we're talking about asking often, is through sermons. And so earlier I said, wait, you said you didn't need sermons. Now you're saying we do need sermons? No. I'm saying don't preach sermons out of crisis, but regularly plan to preach sermons, regularly scheduled sermons. The church I go to here in Atlanta is North Point Community Church, where Andy Stanley is the senior pastor. And every year, they'll have a strategic service Sunday, and every year, once a year, sometimes twice a year, there will be a regular message preached on volunteering, and it just begins a process. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So you've got interest cards, you've got cards on the wall, you've got scheduled sermons. I see backstage tours, churches do that, where they'll schedule a time, whether it's the first Sunday of the month, last Sunday of the month, once a quarter, at some regular interval where they say, we're just going to do a backstage tour, and it'll be during church, or it'll be before church, or it'll be after church. And if you're interested in serving, come here, come to this, and we'll just walk you around and show you. Granger Community Church, who we profiled, does this really well. You might do a volunteer expo. You might have a website where you drive people to. The point is this. As we begin to unpack all these ideas, and you get all these ideas for attracting people, what you need to do is create a system by which you ask often for people to serve. And it's up to you to decide, is that a monthly? Is that what are we asking every week? Are we asking every month? Are we asking every quarter? Are we preaching one sermon a year? Are we preaching two sermons a year? To create that volunteer system by which you're giving regular on-ramps. If it's just a one time a year, you may find, hey, we can't engage enough people. We've got new people, and we don't want to have them wait 6 months, 7 months, 9 months before they jump into serving. And so you need a system by which you're able to ask often for volunteers to jump in. So ask often, that's number one. Principle number 2 is ask everyone. Who can serve in your church? Who can serve in your church? Now I want to share with you a principle that may be a little bit controversial. Because I want to talk to you about lowering the bar for people. You say, well, lower the bar. I think we should raise the bar. I want to talk to you about lowering the bar. I think in your church and in churches all across America, all across the world, we need to provide simple entry points for people to serve. Let me ask it to you like this. Are there places in your church where somebody who is not yet a Christ follower can serve? I think the answer to that ought to be yes. Now, I wouldn't let them teach a Sunday school class. Probably not a great idea to have somebody who's not a Christ follower lead a children's ministry thing or be a student ministry small group leader. There are certainly opportunities of service where being a Christ follower is necessary. Okay? But are there some opportunities? Could you create some opportunities for people who are not yet Christ followers to serve? Could somebody who's not a Christian be a greeter? Could somebody who's not a Christian work maybe with a parking team? Could somebody who's not a Christian come in during the week? Could somebody who's not a Christian work on your website? Are there opportunities for people who are not yet Christians to serve? Another thing, what about new Christians? And these are people who maybe you would say they're rough around the edges, but are there people who are just new to the faith? Are there service opportunities for them? Or is the step so big that it's actually preventing people from serving in your church and in your ministry? Now, there ought to be things where there are applications required. There ought to be things where people need to demonstrate a life of faith. There ought to be opportunities where there's some additional steps. And so here's the principle. I think we need to lower the bar for volunteers, but then raise the bar for leaders. Lower the bar. What if you lowered the bar for some volunteers? If you created some easy entry points to where we say, hey, look, you may not even need to be a member. You don't even have to be a Christian. Here's a place to get involved. As we researched and talked to so many churches, we found out that so many people in so many churches got connected to the life of the church through serving. That there were people who they weren't even fully sure about the church or their faith or where they stood, but they got connected to a serving team and they met some people and they journeyed together, and that was the catalyst for getting them connected to the life of the church. So I want to encourage you to maybe lower the bar in some areas. Now, you can't do that in all areas, but you can do that in some areas. And then when it comes to leadership, you could raise the bar. I just went through, I told you I attend North Point Church, and this past Sunday, I actually attended an orientation for their student ministry environment. My wife and I are considering and praying about serving maybe with middle school or maybe with high school and what that would look like. I don't know if I would pass the filter or not, but we're going through that process because we just want to serve and be a volunteer somewhere. And in their high school ministry, they were very upfront in their orientation, and we'll talk about the process because it's really good. In their orientation, high school small group leaders at North Point make a 4-year commitment to serve. Now that is a really, really, really high bar. But there are other places that you could serve where you can just jump in and get going right away, where that bar is not that high. So I want to encourage you to create, maybe lower the bar, lower the expectations, lower the qualifications, shorten up the process. I mean, is somebody that's really volunteering to be a greeter, do they need to fill out a 17-page application and get a background check? Probably not. Somebody that's working with children, should they do that? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we need to lower the bar in some areas, and we need to raise the bar in leadership with some areas. But the principle here is that we need to ask everyone to serve, that everybody who attends your church is a candidate for volunteering in your church, to create opportunities. And so Fellowship Church out in Texas, they talk about coming into the shallow end of the pool. And I love that metaphor. Some people like to just jump into the deep end. Some people like to put a toe in the shallow end and go in slowly. And you need to create some simple on-ramps, some simple ways for people to just try out serving, to just try out volunteering, so you can ask everyone to serve. And when we talk about asking everyone, I mean everyone. And this is what we don't do well as a church sometimes. Sometimes we try to pigeonhole people, that we have a list of opportunities and we just try to get people to fill those slots in those opportunities. But what you've got to do, and you've got to wrestle through this, is to find a place for leaders, for thinkers, for doers, for creative people, for people who love Excel spreadsheets. You've got to create opportunities for all kinds of people to serve. One of my pet peeves when it comes to volunteer ministry in the church is that we're really good at asking people to serve with their hands. Hey, we've got a church work day. We need you to come. We're going to dig a hole over here. We're putting up a fence. We're mowing the grass. Work with your hands. We've got great opportunities for people to work hands-on. We've got children's ministry. We need you to hold a baby. We need you to hand the bulletin out, to work with your hands. But we don't do so well at asking people to serve with their minds. But there are a significant number of people in your church who are gifted, who God has gifted with mental abilities, creative thinking abilities, processing abilities, to be able to serve with their intellect, with their mind, with a talent that's not quite so tangible. And instead of asking people to just show up and hold this or do that or go there to do this physical work, what about engaging this whole other group of people in your church that's often sitting on the sideline because we haven't engaged them with their mind? Here's some examples of what I think of. What about your website? I mean, it's great that you have some outside people. Maybe you hired a company, maybe outsource all that, whatever, to do a website. But are there people in your church who are gifted in the area of technology who could work on your website? I bet there are. What about social media? Could you find somebody to engage people on social media? Is that a volunteer role in your church? What about editing and proofreading? Do you know you have teachers, people who have college degrees who know how to write and how to edit and how to proofread stuff, and that they'd be glad for you to get their bulletin, to get something that you've written, emails that are going out to the church. There's an opportunity for people to serve with their mind. What about prayer? What about prayer? Could they pray during the week? Could they administrate something? Could they get prayer requests to different people? What about administrative work? Could people come up to the church on Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and help do some administrative work? Maybe with a computer, maybe doing copy. I mean, just different things that could be done. Where are we engaging thought leaders? What about people who God has gifted with the understanding of His Word? Where can we engage volunteers to help in the sermon prep process? Maybe if you're a pastor, you have this person in your church who always comes up and shares theological points with you. If you preach on James 1, they come up and you say, hey, did you know that this word in James 1 actually means this? Well, where is that person serving? And for too long, I think we've kind of pushed that guy out, or we've made fun of that guy, or we say, hey, we've got a sermon critic, we've got our theologian. Well, what if you brought him or her into the mix and said, you've got a gifted mind and we want to help you use your mind in a place of service? What about leaders? A lot of times we think we need to get volunteers, but what about people who've been gifted with leadership? That there's people in your church that they run their own business, or they're in management, or they know how to organize things and lead people. And can those people serve somewhere? Because if you're just looking for doers and not leaders or thinkers, you're going to miss a whole section of your church that God has gifted to build up the body, that they are priests. that they are priests in the church, just like we talked about in the first session, that they're actually gifted and wired in such a way to build up the body. But they just don't do it at 9 o'clock by holding this. They may need to do it sometime during the week with their mind or with their leadership ability. And so when we say ask everyone, I'm talking about ask men, ask women. I'm talking about asking doers, asking thinkers. I'm talking about creating opportunities for all kinds of different people to use their gifts and serve in the church. So principle number 1 is ask often, that you need a regular system in order to schedule out when you're talking about serving and volunteering. And I'm going to give you some homework about that one at the end of this. Principle number 2 is ask everyone, the doers, thinkers, leaders. Ask everyone to serve. Lower the bar in some cases so people can come in at entry-level roles and positions. Raise the bar in some places because that speaks to a different type of person. Principle number 3 is this, is ask personally. Ask personally. Now, when I read the gospel, I love reading the Bible because it's just so interesting. And you see Jesus in the Gospels preaching to massive groups of people, preaching to just tons of people. And he's preaching to people and he's asking a whole bunch of people to do things generally. But you also read in the Bible about Jesus going to specific people and calling them. In Mark chapter 1, verse 17, he looked at somebody specifically and he said, "You come and follow me." So Jesus asked and preached generally, but he also went to certain people and asked them specifically. He would speak to the crowds of people, but he would also speak to people individually and specifically. And I think that's a great model for us for volunteering, that we need to talk about volunteering and serving generally from the pulpit or from the platform, but we also need to ask people personally to serve. And so let me give you a statement. If you want to write this in your notes, this would be a great thing to write down and then talk about and process, is that you can recruit volunteers from the platform. I think it's actually very effective for the pastor to preach a sermon on volunteering and ask people to do something. And we'll talk about how to do that. In fact, we'll give you a great sermon you can use to do that. We think you can recruit volunteers from the platform, but we think you need to invite leaders personally. So you can recruit volunteers from the platform, but you must invite leaders personally. See, leaders, they need to be personally asked. One of the worst things you can do is just to ask for leaders, because leaders don't typically respond to that. Volunteers will respond to that. Doers will respond to that. But leaders often need that personal invitation, whether it's the pastor, whether it's another staff member, a ministry team leader, that leaders sometimes need to be engaged personally. As a side note, one of the things you'll hear us talk about in Volunteer Rocket is we don't think you should use the word recruit. Like, no one wants to be recruited to fill a slot. And so we don't, at Volunteer Rocket, think you should recruit leaders. We think you should invite them. We don't think you should recruit volunteers. We think you should invite them. And when we talk about inviting people personally, I mean, you're really going to them and say, we think here's an opportunity. I think you would be a great person to lead this or to do this or to help us in this area, and I would like to personally ask you to consider doing this. And I think as you ask people personally, you're going to see different results. And so I do think you can recruit volunteers from the platform, and we'll talk about that, but I think you need to recruit leaders or invite leaders personally. Ask them personally. Jesus modeled that for us. And then principle number 4 is to ask specifically. We're talking about attracting people to serve. We're talking about bringing volunteers not into a role, but into a ministry. One of the most effective things you can do is to ask people specifically to do things. Please get generic results, but specific opportunities often get specific people engaged. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When you're creating volunteer opportunities, when you're looking for ways to get people to serve, the more specific you can make that request, the better. And so in other words, let me get real practical. Here's how I would say that. I would not say, we need some people to work with the kids ministry. That's generic, okay? When people hear that, they think, well, I'm not qualified to work in kids ministry. There's a bunch of other people that can work in kids ministry. Instead of that generic ask, what if you ask specifically? And if you said, hey, we need 3 people who really have a heart for special needs children, because at 11 o'clock we're creating a new environment for somebody. And every time you add a level of specificity to that, it triggers something in people's mind. They go, oh, special needs children, I have a passion for that. Oh, 11 o'clock, okay, the time is now narrowed. I understand what's being asked of me. And so we think you should create new specific opportunities for people to serve. One of the things we've seen do this, we've seen churches actually print this in a bulletin or a handout or something, where they would create a list of just 10 specific volunteer opportunities, and to get together with a team and say, let's create 10 new positions that don't exist. They're not generic, but they're specific. We're looking for somebody to edit the bulletin on Tuesday. We're looking for somebody to serve with a special needs. You create specific opportunities. We're looking for somebody to write this by this day, and create specific opportunities. And you'll be amazed as you communicate specifically and ask specifically who's ready to jump in and serve in those things, because specific opportunities engage a different type of person. Another thing, when we talk about ask specifically, we've seen this happen. We've seen a lot of churches find success with this, is to ask for a bunch of volunteers to serve and volunteer with a big specific service project. And so we have a church that we work with called Liquid Church up north in New Jersey, actually, just right outside of New York City. And Rich Birch is on their staff, operations pastor. And Rich told me, he said, we've actually found great success engaging volunteers with just massive service projects. And when we have this new thing that we're trying to do in our community, we'll go to our church, and people who are not serving on a regular basis, they're not working with kids, they're not working with guest services, they're just not really doing anything. This one-time project really engages them. And they jump into serving with this one-time project. And a lot of times that becomes a gateway to them serving. And if they have a great serving experience and they find fulfillment with that short-term project, they're in a great position to stick around. So if maybe you're doing a massive thing and we say, look, we need some people to help with parking. And they come and they help with one-time project for parking. Well, they're great candidates to say, hey, you did a great job with that parking thing. Would you like to be a part of our parking team? We do that actually every week. And that may be a great first step. And so not only can you ask people specifically with specific ongoing opportunities, you can actually create big projects or one-time projects and ask people to sign up to serve just at that event. And I think you're going to find that that's a great way to involve more people in ministry in a way that they weren't doing before. And so that's the fourth principle, is to ask specifically. Now, I told you at the beginning of this that I was going to kind of share with you 4 principles of asking people. And then I was going to share you 5 models for how that actually works in real life church settings when it comes to attracting volunteers. And so I want you to see those principles fleshed out in real life churches that we profiled and that we interviewed. And so I'm going to go through 5 models for asking. So kind of got those principles there. And let's see how those principles work in real life. And so the first model I want to talk to you about is what we call the preaching model. The preaching model. And our example here is going to be a church I've already mentioned. Actually, it's North Point. And so every year, Andy Stanley preaches a message on service, on volunteering. And it's designed to motivate people who've just been regular attenders to jump in to an area of service. And Coach Chef works with the middle schoolers at North Point Ministry. And here's what he said. He actually wrote this. He said, every year we do what we call a Strategic Service Sunday. And so that's kind of code word language for what they call this Sunday, this sermon, this service, this movement. It's called Strategic Service Sunday. He said, every year we do what we call Strategic Service Sunday. Andy uses a whole message to cast vision for what we are as a church and encourages people to get involved. And so in this message, right, Andy crafts this whole message, and it's just geared at moving people kind of from the rows into serving somewhere. And they call this strategic service. And here's a few things that we've learned just from North Point about strategic service, is they actually invite volunteers to serve through this service, through this Strategic Service Sunday, before they're needed. So, for example, I need to explain to you kind of when I'm filming this and how this is happening. Right now, when I'm filming this, it's in the month of March. And right now, North Point is engaging volunteers who are going to serve about 3 months from now, who they're going to jump into serving. And so in that 3 months, they're going to meet, they're going to shadow, they're going to kind of get ready, they're going to do the application process, all these different things. But to serve in their student ministries when those students promote later on in the summer. And so this strategic service, they're actually engaging volunteers before they're needed. So you remember when I said ask according to a plan, not just when there's a crisis, that this is a strategic service because they're inviting people to get involved in strategic places of service, but it's also strategic in when they ask. And so they're asking people to jump in and serve really before they're needed. And what they do a great job of is looking at the calendar and being mindful of that calendar from year to year and going, when do we want to involve people? And because they've done this year after year after year, they know when they need to talk about this, they know what the process looks like, and they need to know when those volunteers are going to be deployed. And actually, if you go to North Point Resources website, and in the ebook, I put the link, and it's a link that you can click on. You can actually go and get several, I think 4 of Andy's strategic service messages. And so you can get those messages and see them and listen to them and see how Andy preached on serving. One of the messages, he preached on Acts 6. He preached on the people, the widows, and how they were, complaining, and how they elected a group of people to meet those needs. And he preaches through this idea of serving. It's connected to the mission and the vision of the church. And it would be great for you to go and get those messages and learn from that. And so here's what we would say. If you're going to adopt this model, to not wait around till there's a volunteer crisis, but to strategically 1 or 2 times a year, go ahead and put those messages on the calendar. Go ahead and write preach on volunteering. Go ahead and write strategic service on that Sunday. So you go ahead and teach those messages based on that. Now, here's what's so important when you talk about preaching on this, that at North Point, there's a great follow-up process for the sermon. The sermon is not the end all. The sermon kicks off the process. And at the sermon, they drive everybody to the card. You fill out the interest card. In fact, my wife and I just went through this, not as research for Volunteer Rocket, but because we want to serve at our church. And so we filled out that interest card. And then we got an email. And then we were invited to an orientation. And then from that orientation, there's actually a sit-down, because this is with student ministry, there's actually a sit-down meeting. And there's an application. And then there's a process by which somebody comes in. And we're going to talk about how that can work in your church. But that strategic Sunday service, that preaching, that sermon kind of kickstarts that whole process. And it's so amazing when you go and listen to these messages that Andy doesn't use guilt to motivate people to serve. He doesn't say you owe it to the church. He doesn't say if you want to be a real Christian. He connects it to the vision of the church, but it's very motivational. It's designed to get people to serve. And they tell stories of people who I'm not sure if this is for me. They tell great stories. It would be a great, great thing for you to learn from Andy is how he does it. The bottom line here is to ask according to a plan, not under pressure. So go ahead and put that on the calendar. When are we preaching on serving? And how are we going to follow up with people after that message in order to get them connected? That's the preaching model. And we think you could do that, and that could work great in your church. Let me teach you the second model. The second model is the class model. The class model. And the church we profiled here that does this really, really, really well is Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama. They have multiple campuses. Pastor Chris Hodges, they have a great team. I talked about them in the first module as well, that they're able to involve so many people in serving. They're able to keep their staff budget lower because they have so many people serving. But Church of the Highlands does something that is really strategic. It's very systematic, and it works really well to get more people in ministry. And what they have is they have a series of classes that they call the growth track. And the growth track at Church of the Highlands is designed to take somebody from just who is interested in learning more about the church to go through 101, 201, 301, 401. And they go through those classes. And the fourth class in that series is all about finding your place to serve. And the cool thing about this model, the cool thing about this is class 401 happens on the last Sunday of the month, every month. Every month. I think they take December off. But they have a regularly scheduled time by which, this is a pretty big church, so every time they do it, couple hundred people will go through 401 and constantly come into serving in Church of the Highlands. It's a system. It's a class. And they've said, we're going to do this class, and here's the times we're going to do it. We're going to do it the last Sunday of the month. And this is going to be the way that we bring people in. And so here's what they're doing. They figured it out, that they're asking according to a plan, not under pressure. That they know every single month there's going to be a certain number of people that are going to go through class 401, and we're going to have an opportunity to follow up with people who are interested in serving every single month. And that's part of their plan. In fact, when we talked to Church of the Highlands, and we've given you an interview, a Skype interview. We did an interview with Amy Lee, who is just a great person, a great leader, and just had some great stuff to say about how this 401 class works at Highlands and how it really works. They said one of their secret sauces is in that 401 class is they help people understand what their gifts are so that they can serve according to their gifts, the way they're wired, not just the needs of the church. And Amy Lee told me, she said the secret sauce at Highlands is that we do gifts-based ministry, not needs-based ministry. Needs-based ministry is we got all these needs and we need people to fill them. We need people to fill them. Gift-based ministry is what are you good at? How are you wired? And then how can we connect your gifts with a specific opportunity? And their 401 class really works for that. But that's a model. And that's a way that they're constantly able to ask often, because there's a group of people who are interested in raising their hand and say, hey, I'm going to go through these classes. And there's a group of people that they ask to serve often. So when we say ask often, Highlands does it. They just don't do it from the platform all the time. They do it in their class structure. They have a class model. And so we think you can learn something from Pastor Chris and from Amy Lee and from Church of the Highlands about that class structure of having that regularly scheduled time to talk about volunteering with people who are interested in volunteering. So that's model number 2. Model number 3, I call the relationship model. The relationship model. And the church that we think does this really, really, really well is Granger Community Church in Granger, Indiana. And I had the opportunity to talk with them and learn from them. And Granger, they talk about something called shoulder tapping. They say they practice shoulder tapping. Now, they'll do sermons and they'll have some other things. But Mark Waltz told me that those other things that they have, the sermons and the classes and all that other stuff, it really just supports shoulder tapping. Shoulder tapping is simply just a volunteer asking another volunteer to serve with them. And that in Granger, their culture is that if you're a volunteer, one of your jobs is to find other people to do this with you. That you're doing life. Maybe you've got some neighbors and some friends, and yes, you can invite them to come to church, but you can also invite them to serve with you. And then as you meet people, whether it's out in the community or whether at church, as you rub shoulders, as you tap shoulders with somebody, you say, hey, would you like to do this with me? And their sermons and their other things really support this model. Another church that we talked to is Freedom Church here in Atlanta, and they're teams of people. They may have different volunteer teams. That each one of those teams is responsible for growing that team, so much so that team has goals for how many more new people they want to bring into the team. And so, attracting volunteers at Freedom Church isn't just the job of the pastor, Pastor JR. The job of attracting volunteers is actually pushed down to each team, that each team is responsible for attracting people. And we think this is a great way to grow a volunteer team in your church, whether it's greeters, whether it's kids ministry or student ministry, different teams of people. If you can have those teams be on the lookout for relationships that they can develop and push forward in order to bring more people into that volunteer team, into that volunteer role. And so that's the third model. It's the relationship model. And Granger does that. Freedom does that really well. The fourth model is, it might be new. In fact, when we started doing our research, we thought this was just a unique idea that may not work at every church, but we thought it was worth talking about because it was a really, really, really good idea. And it's from a church called Fraser United Methodist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And you may have not heard of that church, but it's a pretty big church. They're doing really well. And what they do, it was so interesting, and I wanted to share this with you because I thought it was a unique model for how to engage volunteers. They do what we call the campaign model. The campaign model. Now, a lot of churches do this when it comes to finances. And so every fall, for example, a church might kind of gear up. They might talk about the vision of the church. And here's what we want to accomplish as a church. And here's what our budget's going to be. And we want you to give and examine your giving and look at stewardship. And let's talk about generosity and kind of make a commitment to what you're going to give financially the next year. And kind of take all that and kind of wrap it into the budget. Well, what Fraser did is they took that campaign and they expanded it. They said, hey, we didn't want this just to be about money. We didn't want this to be just about stewardship. This should just be about discipleship. And they took their campaign that they do every fall and they create a name for it. They create a brand for it. They launch it with a dinner. They have small groups. I mean, it really is a campaign. But they don't just make it about money. They make it about involvement. They make it about discipleship, about how you're going to grow. And they actually, so they kick it off with a dinner where they talk about it. They have a message series that they preach for 3-4 weeks. And it culminates with a commitment Sunday where everybody in the church makes a commitment. Hey, I'm going to be a part of this ministry. I'm going to be a part of generosity in this way, and I'm going to commit to serve for a year in this way. And so they basically created a holistic model. And when I talked to them, they said that they wanted to make this a holistic part of the discipleship process. They didn't want to just limit it to money, because serving and involvement is really a big thing. And we wanted to connect this dots to say this is a holistic thing for the entire next year. And I thought that was a great way to look at it. And the reason I wanted to include this is because they figured something out, is that they wanted to ask according to a plan, not under pressure. That their plan for bringing in volunteers is through a big campaign in the fall, to where which they look at the entire next year, not just for generosity, but for involvement and for serving as well. And that's a great idea for a plan. So I wonder if something like that would work for your church as well. And then model number 5, I want to share with you model number 5, is I just call it the simple step model. The simple step model. And again, we've seen a bunch of churches actually do this. And so I could lump a bunch of churches together in this. But we'll call this like an orientation. And we've seen a lot of churches do what, whether it's the first Sunday of the month, or hey, we've got one coming up in 3 weeks, or just on some regular schedule, whether it's monthly, might be quarterly, they do an orientation or a voluntour where they basically just gather people together. Say, if you're interested in serving, just come to this. It's no pressure. We're just going to tour you around and show you some of the different areas where you could serve. And having that happen on a regular basis is a very simple step. So again, think through somebody who's not serving. If they're not serving somewhere, and it's after church or it's during church, and there's just a simple 20-minute, 30-minute, 45-minute thing where you can come and you can see the different areas. And a lot of times seeing it is better than just hearing about it. And so you could take people around. I think one of the greatest ways to do this is actually during church. When there's childcare and they're already planning to be there anyway. And you know what? It's okay that they miss a message every now and then. And so you pull them out. You say, we're going to take you around to all the different environments in the church and just show you what's happening in kids ministry. Show you what happened, before church. Talk about it in the, backstage, or talk about the different areas of the church. Go out into the lobby and talk about what the greeters do. Out in the parking lot, talk about how many cars are there. And you can just tour people around and show them all the things, kind of a behind the scenes, where they can see what's happening. And as they see it, they go, oh, you know what? I see myself fitting in that area. And that's a very simple step that you could get. And again, what we would encourage you to do is to do this according to plan, not under pressure. Don't wait till you need volunteers, but schedule these things out and say, this is what we're going to do in order to get volunteers. Now, let me tell you kind of the secret, the silver bullet to this, and or the secret sauce to all this, is you don't have to choose just one of these. In fact, what we've seen is the churches that have very healthy volunteer ministries, that have great cultures, is they may pick 2 or 3 of these things and they'll put it together in a plan. But they are strategically deciding how and when we're going to bring new volunteers in, what our system is for attracting volunteers. And what they do is they put it all on a calendar. And so here is your homework. We're giving you homework. And this, you cannot skip this. You must do this. We've given you a calendar. And we want you to go through and we want you to talk about your team to say which one of these models works best for us. Are we going to do preaching? Are we going to do classes? Do we want to do a campaign? Are we doing simple steps? What is our model? How are we going to talk about volunteering? How often and when and in what way? And I want you to look at the calendar and actually put your on-ramps on the calendar, because it is a system. It is looking at the thing comprehensively and saying, this is how people engage in our ministry. Creating that system, writing it down on a calendar, and actually putting those on-ramps on the calendar, that's your homework. And so what I want you to do before you move on to the next step is to get your team together, print out the calendar and say, how are we asking? When are we asking? And what are we doing in the process? And so again, you might combine some of these. You might say, well, we're going to do a sermon here, then we're going to follow it up with a volunteer here. Or we're going to do classes here, but we're going to preach on volunteering here and here. And you're going to put all of that onto a calendar. And when you step back from it, you're going to say, this is how we attract people into serving. And so you're not going to be running around like crazy from week to week to week. You're not going to be dealing with people saying, oh, we need this, do this, pastor say this, announce this, preach on this. That you're going to have a plan. And when you have a good plan, you're going to be able to trust that plan. And you'll be able to tweak the plan and improve it and make it a little better. But the power comes in the planning. When you create a plan for attracting volunteers into ministry, you've got a regular system for how people are coming on board. And then you do that plan year after year after year. And you make it a little bit better the next time, and a little bit better the next time, and a little bit better the next time. But you've got a good plan. You've got buy-in. You've involved your team in the plan. And then you're able to execute the plan. And so attracting volunteers into ministry is so important, not just because you have things to do, but remember, because they're priests, because your job as pastor is to equip people to do the work of the ministry. And so you can't do all the ministry. You've got to go attract and involve other people in the ministry. So your homework, create your plan, decide your on-ramps, and put them all on your calendar. And then we're going to move on to the next one. That's A. B is really good. B is how we're going to begin to build, and we're going to begin to train, and we're going to build up teams of people that actually know what they're doing, that they're not just attracted, but that we build into them, and so that they're prepared and ready to serve. And so in our next video, Casey's going to talk about how you can begin to build those teams together.